This is our third evidence session, and this morning and today we're looking at state capacity, the ability of fragile states to get things done, to deliver public services, to deliver reasonable level of government. This morning we've had our academic review, which has been extremely helpful, and now we're going to listen to some evidence from some experts out in the field. I'll introduce our witnesses in a minute, but just the sort of running order is we're going to have brief introductory statements from our witnesses. 5 minutes, but 7 absolutely maximum. I will put a stopwatch on, and I'm not afraid of stopping people in mid-flow because I think we want to leave as much time for questions as possible. Then we're going to spend the next hour, first of all, with some questions from my fellow commissioners, and then we've got today here students and academics and postgrads and others who will want to join in. Some of that might be before a break for lunch, and some of it will be after a break for lunch. But first of all, can I thank you very much for coming? It's really good that you've given the time. Who we've got, just going left to right, Michael Barber, who set up the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit at number 10 Downing Street and ran it till 2005. And when I was Prime Minister, he visited Pakistan over 50 times in order to help with the delivery of educational programs, and he's going to talk a bit about that and other lessons he's learnt. We've got Sanjeev Gupta, Deputy Director of Fiscal Affairs Department at the IMF. It says here he has authored and co-authored over 150 papers on macroeconomic and fiscal issues. Fortunately, you didn't send all of them to us for our reading, but you sent an extremely strong and good paper, and we're looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. Ifueko, you're here, right? Okay. You're meant to be... I know it's a bit like a courtroom, don't worry, but you're meant to be sitting here. Managing Partner of Compliance Professionals, but more to the point, a Commissioner in the Independent Commission for the Reform of Corporate Taxation, and has served as Executive Chairman of Nigeria's Federal Inland Revenue Service. And crucially, one of the things we're going to be looking at in state capacity, state effectiveness, is the issue of the effectiveness of tax systems and the ability to raise and therefore spend revenue. And finally, we've got Alex Thier, who for many years worked with President Obama at USAID and is now Executive Director of the Overseas Development Institute. You've all sent in papers, which have been incredibly helpful, but today is really about hearing frank views from you about what we need to do, and then questions and answers. Just to sort of remind everybody, the task of the Commission is incredibly difficult, but it's also quite simple and clear, is that we are trying to write the rule book for aid and development for the next period, because pretty soon over half the world's poorest are going to be living in fragile states, and so we won't be able to help tackle global poverty unless we can help fragile states. And so really we're starting with this very academic work of what works and what doesn't, but in the end we've got quite a simple approach, which is we want to try and find out, when it comes to helping fragile states, be legitimate, be effective, solve conflicts, deliver for their people, what works, what doesn't work, what's been tried and failed and succeeded, and what hasn't been tried, and why do things that work, and why do things that don't work not work. So in the end, it's a very complicated and very difficult task, but it's quite straightforward, the aim. With that, let's start with Michael Barber. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure what we call Mr. Cameron, former Prime Minister.
Call me Dave, whatever suits.
I'm going to try and click through this presentation quite quickly, and I'll stick to certainly to 7 minutes, and I'll try and do 5 minutes. I think it's a really important theme, and I'm very glad that you personally have taken it on, and your commissioner is a very distinguished, and it's a real honour to be able to present to you. As you mentioned in the introduction, I've been to Pakistan 51 times. I've been working with various provinces, but mainly with the Chief Minister of Punjab, first on education, but now on health, water, sanitation of cities, and all of those things. And there are certain key lessons that I've learnt from that. Pakistan is not as fragile as some places, I'm very well aware of that, but when I first went in 2009, the Taliban were 18 miles from Islamabad. It's worth bearing that in mind, and there were a lot of security incidents, and now, fortunately, many fewer. Long may it stay that way. I have a very close bond with the Chief Minister of Punjab, and I'm going to focus on the work that he and I have been doing together. for each of his areas that he's focused on, can somebody click it on wherever the control of that is? Thanks. This isn't working. But for each of the areas he's working on, he has very, very clear priorities and measurable goals. Sorry.
That is a problem. We'll do it manually on a computer.
Yeah.
That's... No?
Apologies.
Ah, there we are. Let's see if it works.
Yeah. So this we've already done.
Yeah.
We've already covered. So education is one of his priorities, and these are the goals we've set for 2018. I'm not going to go through them all. I'm just showing that they're clear, they're measurable, they're ambitious. And Shahbaz Sharif, the picture you see there, is very ambitious, really displays urgency, and does get things done. And we review progress every 2 or 3 months, he and I, with about 80 of the people in the education system, or similarly in health, or similarly in water. And the key to this is the stuff that I've been working on since I was in number 10 and writing about ever since, which is basically deliverology, as the Treasury used to mockingly call it. But basically a very simple approach to getting things done. Set some goals, make sure there are plans with trajectories towards the goals, work out what the delivery chain is between you, the Prime Minister, and a citizen benefiting, make sure you get good data in close to real time, use routines such as stocktakes so that political leaders don't just manage crises, but actually review progress on the things they care about most on a regular basis and use their time wisely. When you find a problem, solve it, and keep the focus even when things go wrong or there are distractions. It's simple stuff, as actually the former Prime Minister was saying in his introduction. You've got to stick to it. And I must say the Chief Minister of Punjab is fantastic on this. I just want to give you an example. So we use robust data. We get robust data using technology on health, on education, on water and sanitation. On technology, the technology we use for this is a health example. We give every vaccinator a tablet. We know exactly where they are at any given moment. Every child they vaccinate, they photograph. That photograph goes straight into a computer in Lahore. We know exactly how many children have been vaccinated, in which places. The map in the top right-hand corner is a set of polygons showing where the green is where the vaccination coverage is good, the red is where the challenges are. We can target those places. This is in one tiny local area. And the other thing is when the child is vaccinated, we say to the mother, did you have this baby with a skilled birth attendant present in a basic health unit, or were you at home? So we also know where the most risk to mother's health is during childbirth. And then we check the data using telephone audit. Simple stuff, but it makes all the difference. We're able to do maps like this. This is an education one. This is enrolment across Punjab in schools. It tells you exactly where the challenge of enrolment is. It's down in the southwest corner. The enrolment drive, you will be very familiar with Southland. That's where we focus the enrolment drive starting in August. So we're using the data to get targeted interventions in pretty much real time, and we'll review that on my next visit at the beginning of October. We do monthly notes to the Chief Minister. This actually is an example from Peru, where they're doing a similar thing where I was last week. A monthly note to the Prime Minister. You can see simple, clear data. The ministers responsible are identified at the top. The action agreed at the last stock take is listed and traffic lighted. We can see where it's done, and the commentary tells you why it's working, or if it's not working, why it's not working, exactly what the former Prime Minister said in introducing it. Very, very simple one-page note for a Prime Minister monthly. The Chief Minister gets this on health, education, water and cleaner cities every month. And we're tracking the data, as you can see. There's some lessons which I want to finish with. First of all, lessons for the countries and provinces you're talking about, the fragile places. On the red side are the things that I see that were very wrong in Punjab when I first started, and are still wrong in large parts of the world. And on the green side is what I think we need to put in place. And I'm not saying this solves all the problems of fragile states, but you need to find political leaders, because without political leadership, you'll see things through. It's very difficult to get things done. You need to deal with appointments on merit. There's far too many political appointments to, for like teacher transfers and so on, that just get in the way of delivery. Or the 36 districts of Punjab with, they used to be all political appointments, now they're all on merit. You need officials who stay in post in Punjab and other parts of, it's still true in many provinces in Pakistan. There'll be 2 or 3 secretaries of education in a year. You can't get anything done with that. So you've got to sort out these basic problems. Where you see corruption, you've got to name it. You've got to convince people that they can succeed. They've had so many years of failure that they just don't expect to succeed, and they defeat themselves in their own head. So that, to me, is all very important. And I guess the single job I play most importantly in Punjab is ensuring it's an honest conversation. So that officials can't fudge the data when they present it to the Chief Minister. They have to, they know I'm going to tell it how it is, and so they have to deal with it. And then radical transparency, getting the data out there. All the data I've shown you is public daily, and then staying the course in spite of crises, floods, security, and all the rest of it. And then for aid agencies, this is where I'll finish. I think aid historically has tried to separate technical assistance from politics. Actually, you've got to work with effective political leaders. I think that's a mistake. Unlocking ambition, you have to get some early wins to show people that they can make a difference, because they've often given up. Genuine expertise, even without funding, is better than funding without genuine expertise in getting things done. You can pour a lot of money into a country, but if there's no expertise in the way it's allocated, it's a problem. You need to try to influence whole government budgets, not just boutique initiatives that aid agencies want, that are separate. Like in Punjab, the aid in total is less than 5% of the government, but we're influencing the whole health budget, the whole education budget, the whole water budget, etc. And then devolution is one of these themes that you come across in aid publications, and it's very vague about what is to be devolved and what's to be held centrally. Like, for example, you need a data system that is central, but that enables you to devolve. So it's being very specific about what devolution actually means. And there's no excuse for not having good real-time data. If we can do it in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Punjab, we can do this anywhere. You can get very, very good data now using technology. We know where every rubbish collection truck in Punjab is at any given moment, for example. It's not hard. And then you've got to stick with it, even though it gets tough.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely 5 minutes, so thank you. And very clear, and also very optimistic about what can be done. Thank you. Sanjeev, we're going to take everybody's presentations and then do questions. And I'll probably kick off at the start with a question for each of you, then we'll open it up to everyone else.
I kept within the 7 minutes.
I think so. My stopwatch went off at some stage. Failure of technology. Yes, you did.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank the Commission for giving us the opportunity to share some of the work that we have done at the IMF and the work that is ongoing. And the IMF is very heavily involved in fragile states in helping them build institutions or maintain macro stability so that they can formulate sound fiscal and monetary policies. So, and our most recent work, which I'm going to present now, is really the work on helping to build fiscal institutions in these countries, and I'm going to focus on that. What are the experiences that we have found? And in the past 5 years, our technical assistance, that is from the IMF, has quadrupled to fragile states. So there is a huge amount of work that is going on. So we basically focus on roughly about 39 fragile states. The number has gone up and down because of the definition of fragile states, which is the definition we use is very similar to what the bank uses with some minor variation, which I won't go into at this point. And at one point in time, we had some 53 countries which were deemed to be fragile, which meant roughly 30% of the membership of the fund was seen as fragile. So that makes it a large set of countries. Over time, about 18 countries have exited fragility by building some institutions. But we still have, as I said, 39 countries which are viewed as fragile. So what has been the progress in these countries in the last 10 years? So they have managed to raise more revenues, approximately by about 1.5 percentage point of GDP on average. But the differential with the non-fragile states has remained because non-fragile states have also increased revenues. But there are a lot of interesting features that come out from their tax structure. One is that they rely very heavily on taxes on trade. They don't rely on, as much as one would see, on more stable sources of taxation, which is taxation on goods and services. They don't have much of income taxation. They don't have the institutions to be able to do it. On the expenditure side, they spend a hell of a lot on wages and salaries. And they also spend a lot on capital expenditures, but mainly because it's donor funded. They also have, on average, about 5% of GDP as external grants, which is more than what other low-income countries get, but it is less than what they were getting 10 years ago as a percentage of GDP. So they are getting less, but still it's a substantial amount that they are getting. So what has been our strategy in these countries? So our strategy is very much country-specific and incremental. Let me explain. So in the paper that we submitted, we defined 3 stages. A stage where conflict is ongoing, and the second stage where the conflict has ceased or disaster has ended, and that we can go in. And the third stage is when things are relatively more stable. And in the first stage, we basically interface remotely because we are not allowed to go into those countries. But in the second stage, we go with ideas which is to come up with some very simplistic things, which is less tax telecommunications, put excise on that because it's easily taxable. So we try to raise simple kind of revenues in those countries in the initial stages. For the budget side, the objective is to consolidate all the cash resources, the financial resources that the country has, and then to formulate a simple budget and to execute it. And what we find is that on the expenditure side, a lot of donors like to see some advisors stationed in the countries, mainly because I think they want to make sure that their resources are well utilized. So we find a lot more advisors that are covered by different donors, and we oversee those advisors. So we have these kind of patterns on the expenditure and revenue side, which then allow us to focus on certain stages of development in the technical assistance. So in the second stage, we see them more or less as similar to other developing countries, other low-income countries, where we start thinking more in terms of medium term. But having defined these stages, it doesn't mean that we move from one stage to the other in a linear fashion. It doesn't happen that way because you may see country go back into conflict. Take the case of South Sudan. We spend a lot of time in building some basic institutions. We have withdrawn all our support from that country. We are giving some support in the third country, in the remote areas, but we are not able to deal directly with the authorities. So we don't know what will happen. Same thing in Yemen. We will have the same kind of problems once we are asked to go back. Similarly, in Afghanistan, we are still doing some work, but not Afghanistan proper, but outside Afghanistan. So these examples tell you that you don't really move from one stage to the other in a systematic fashion. It is possible that you start and then you go back again and you start afresh. So that has an important bearing on the kind of technical assistance that we end up providing. Having said all that, have we seen any improvement in these countries? Yes, there is an improvement. If you look across the countries that have been intensive recipient of assistance from us, and we identified 70% of the countries that have received more technical assistance from us, their revenue ratios went up by 4 percentage points of GDP. And similarly, on the expenditure side, we found that their budgets were more credible, their cash management practices were better, as assessed by this, what they call the PIFA tool, which has had repeated assessments in these countries. So there has been some improvement in the countries that received more intensive technical assistance. What have we learned from our experiences? We have learned that we need to sequence our reforms very effectively, because we have to make sure that some things we don't start presenting more sophisticated reforms at the beginning, because there is pressure sometimes from different parties to think of putting in more sophisticated reforms. But we need to start simple and then move to the next stage. We should start thinking in terms of medium-term strategies for these countries once stability has been established. The other thing is we have to pay more attention, given the point that I made earlier, that there is more reliance on custom revenues, that we need to spend more efforts in providing technical assistance on customs. I think we have not done as much as we should have. Then we need to think of more flexible ways of providing technical assistance depending on the country needs. In some countries, we may have to provide more advisors. In others, we may need to provide short-term visits. So it depends. We need to, and we have started to do more and more of that. And then, we would like to integrate all these things that we are doing into the fund's core activities like surveillance and program design. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you again for the paper, which has got some very encouraging figures for the more work you've done, the higher the increase in revenues and the better the exit from fragilities. That's been really helpful. Now to someone who's worked at the sharp end of a tax system in a state that has all sorts of challenges, Ifueko, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, to share my experience in building the tax capacity in Nigeria. And I left office in April 2012, just in perspective. Now, before I share my experience, my reflections since then, I'd like to put some caveats to the submission because I think it's also very relevant. First of all, whereas I do admit that we've progressed the institution, so as I share my experience, please put that in context, there's still a lot to be done in entrenching what I'll call an automated service and linking it to an e-government platform that connects it all. So FRS is not yet there. Secondly, judging from the length of time it took to confirm my successor, which was about 4 years, with 2 acting chairmen in between, as well as what I'll call the current hues and cries from existing and past staff, succession planning could have been better handled, avoiding the politicization of the position of the executive chairman. Third, it will appear that much as, and I'll go through that, clearly there was progress. It got to a point I actually doubted whether there was progress, but I think 5 years after, and just getting all kinds of feedback since then, I would be also admit that there was progress. But the underpinnings of the changes made during my tenure and what is required to build on what I had started were not actually properly understood. That notwithstanding, I'd like to just talk about some of the achievements that were made. It included development of a first ever national tax policy, passage of 5 out of 9 tax bills that were proposed, including the enactment of the Federal Inland Revenue Service Establishment Act, which made it a semi-autonomous agency, several tax administrative initiatives which spanned every aspect of tax administration, as well as organizational structure change, institution of several policies and processes to drive positive culture change within the organization. And more importantly, all publics recognized the importance of the tax system and staff became champions of the change process. Now, what is the focus of my tenure? I think, first of all, I was encouraged during my selection process, and I emphasize that because it's very key in the appointment of leaders, as executive chairman, which included an interview with the then President Obasanjo, right from the very start, that I had a blank sheet of paper. So that was an incentive for me to perform. I was given the freedom to shape the tax system in the right direction, provided it achieved the goal of growing the non-oil tax revenue. We depended on oil revenues, and in fact, because of these changes, we were able to at least manage the shocks of the decline in oil prices. Ultimately, the support from the 3 presidents I worked with, which was President Obasanjo, Yar'Adua, and Jonathan, was key. You could say that I was lucky with that. But I'll also add that my background as strategy consultant, and you'll find that in the lessons learned later on, and all my past experiences and formation as a person also helped. I approached the job not as a typical tax person, which I wasn't. I did have some tax experience, but I was actually more of a change management consultant. But as a change agent, in framing the problem, I set out not just to reform the tax system in a narrow tax sense, but to reform minds within and outside the FRS. The tax system was defined to include everyone, not just the tax authority, but also the various tiers of government, federal, state, and local government, and across governments, executive, legislature, and judiciary, and the public at large. I also had a threefold agenda: policy, legislation, and administration. I felt you couldn't just tackle administration without also looking at policy and legislation. Right from the very beginning, I engaged all staff in developing the reform plan and identifying champions to work with. And basically, I'd like to thank the IMF and the World Bank who supported the efforts, even though I must say at some point I did wonder that all prescriptions seemed to come from one template. Considering the Federal Inland Revenue Service was primarily about service, I made focus on the people of the organization a priority. As I've mentioned in other interviews, I came alone and I left alone, with the mindset that I needed to sink or swim with the staff to make the FRS better than I met it. I recognized very early on that I needed people to succeed, and I could not make the necessary changes on my own. I had heard after accepting the job that I was about to head a very corrupt organization. And you might say, but how come I didn't know that? I was a very naive person, I must say. But after some attempts at tackling corruption, I made up my mind that one, corruption could become my sole agenda and just overwhelm me if not handled properly. And two, that I will create a fair and supportive environment for staff and distinguish what I will call the wheat from the chaff. And by that, what do I mean? Some people were simply broke or misguided, and to survive, dipped their hands in the pot. Salaries were what I'll call criminally low. There was no incentive to perform. Human resource policies did not exist. Nobody really cared. My focus was therefore to first eliminate the issues affecting those who were just trying to survive, and as much as possible provide an environment that gave them a reason to stay true to their innate values. I did recognize that regardless of the environment they operated, you still would have people who will be involved in corruption, but that was not my immediate focus. I also realized that a lot of communication and awareness was necessary to ensure all stakeholders, especially the staff and the public, were on the same page as much as possible. I decided that rather than pursue corruption primarily, I would deal with cases of corruption as they occurred. That way, I sent strong signals of what can or cannot be tolerated, and that led to the first ever conviction on the forgery of a tax grant certificate, which was very rampant and still is rampant, and other convictions on this and several other cases of corruption. This approach freed me to focus on building the right working environment, improving funding for operations and basic working tools, transforming the organization from a very manual-driven one to a more technology-oriented one, keeping staff fully engaged, developing a culture of performance such that bonuses were tied to performance on a monthly basis, encouraging self-development at all levels with laid-out plans for training, from the most basic on learning how to use a computer and actually seeing people who were actually scared of using a computer, and this is as of 2004, to more complicated areas like transfer pricing and tax treaty development and negotiations. And to put in perspective, putting in place a working environment that worked. On a tour of the offices, and I had to get graphic to get the necessary approvals. You had roofs caving into tax offices. You had tax files on the floor. You had absolutely no recording system, and we wanted the staff to perform. I cannot say that all these changes were followed through after my exit. In fact, the organization's structure to entrench checks and balances and entrench staff capacity building in the assignment of roles and responsibilities was actually significantly changed at one point. However, some parts of the system, especially those driven by legislation, are still operations. So what are my reflections? I have reflected these past 5 years, not just on my tenure at the FRS, but also on my combined experiences and observations prior to and after that. In a sense, you could say that my entire life has been about learning and relearning and pondering the questions, why can't we make significant progress in Nigeria? In Africa, why the fits and stats? What I'm discussing is not peculiar to the FRS. I can give you at least 3 or 4 other institutions where it starts off being very positive, and then subsequently it just peters out. Why the 1 step forward and sometimes 5 steps backwards? I also draw on a very traumatic experience with the recent death of my mother, my dear mother, in November last year, who was shot by armed robbers, survived the shots, but couldn't survive the Nigerian healthcare system. I spent 3 weeks inside a hospital as a first-hand observer with my change hat on. I resolved that the same issues affect the healthcare sector and indeed all sectors in Nigeria and possibly Africa. The difference is that in the healthcare system, you actually see people die from lack of awareness and education, lack of a duty of care to healthcare professionals and ultimately the patients, lack of laid-down processes and systems, lack of funding, lack of capacity, and also just not framing the solutions right. I've also pondered on a variety of other related questions. What did I do? Because actually immediately I finished office, I was tired, I was up to my neck with, I was stressed out, and I actually took some time off to just say, you know what, I need to go back to school. So, but what did I do that people of all ethnic groups, known and unknown, I get accosted at the airports, I get accosted on planes, I get moved on the front line just because they remember seeing me on television. What did I do right? What is succession planning so difficult? Why do we embezzle with such impunity? Why is the society so much a part of the challenge? Why is it so hard to get people on the same page as you are? Why do Nigerians excel so well as individuals outside Nigeria, and yet we just do not get our act together when we come back home? Is the problem so overwhelming for the few available to address? Are foreign nations and institutions compounding the problems by not understanding the root cause of the challenges faced and just assuming that they know? At the heart of the issue, after watching Dave Cameron, I do agree that it is very difficult and complicated to get policy right. It is therefore difficult for me when I talk about lessons learned as only arising from my FRS tenure. Permit me to digress a little into the lessons I have learned about building capacity for change in the Nigerian state in my 33+ years of working experience. And I have 7 lessons. 1. The underdevelopment of the tax system in fragile states, while important, is not an isolated issue. While some progress can be made in isolating sectors, all sectors are inextricably linked to each other. An effective revenue authority achieves more in an environment where the government as a whole is seen as effective and the public feel recognized that government is sensitive to their needs as people. 2, it takes time, a long time, for people to understand and be on the same page. And let me add, even more so when the fundamental educational system, the culture, are very varied, and you haven't used education to bring people together. Once you're on the right principle-centered path of development, just keep doing what needs to be done in spite of opposition or other challenges faced. You should not give up. 3, skills matter, but not just skills. Character and skills matter. We need a critical mass of leaders, not at a point in time. It's not just about a leader. It's about the critical mass of leaders. But on a continuing basis, through properly thought-through succession planning, leaders who have the right combination of research, understanding the position of data, planning and execution skills required at any point in time, but more importantly, to recognize the importance of people and principle-centered actions that are seen, perceived as sincere and fair. 4, we need to be creative in solution development and factor in all principles of change management into whatever needs to be done. We really are in a change situation, and we need to recognize and wear the change cap, because we're actually moving people from things they've never understood to things where they now need to understand. We're moving people from what they're used to doing to things that they need to start changing. So it's actually a change process that we need to bear in mind. There is no linear path to success. 5, we need a thorough understanding of history, the culture, and the why of our current situation to enable us frame the issues properly. A recent book just came out last week on one of the people that were killed in the Biafra War, or the trigger to the Biafra War in 1966. And just reading the book and reading several other books, we've ignored issues that have been there for a very long time. Talk about framing the issue properly. For example, in today's world, corruption has taken center stage as the problem. My hypothesis is that we are not properly framing the problem. That corruption is a symptom of a larger issue that we haven't sufficiently drilled down to understanding and then tackling. In so doing, also even recognize that the corrupt persons that we talk about in themselves may be victims of a grossly unfair system that has made them lose any sense of interest in the next person. That perhaps at the root of why we are where we are is the African culture and its variance, because nobody can really recognize what that culture really is in different spheres of society, further complicated by our tastes, subsidized lifestyles, and unfair educational systems that do not have at its root a clear understanding of who we are and what we need to compete in a globally changing environment. I have been lucky, and that's why I talk about the fact that I'm in a way lucky, uniquely positioned, because if I look at so many different issues, my family set up, the education I went through, the fact that I was on scholarship from the government right from secondary school, it positioned me and my mindset in a particular way. But how many people are so lucky? I fall in the minority. That we do not understand our strengths and therefore are losing what we had, such as our communal spirit, nor do we acknowledge our fundamental weaknesses driven by old age agrarian practices and folklore, such as injustice, unfairness, and distrust, so that we can consciously remove the bitterness and resentment that lies at the heart of a number of leaders and people. 6, we should be open to listen, engage, and involve stakeholders, no matter who they are. And 7, we need research and data-driven policies that properly address underlying issues and ensure the right strategies thought through and actions taken. Let me just quote
briefly, please. So we can do lots of this in questions, but I'm very conscious I want to get everybody in. But if you wind up this point, it's very, very good.
Okay, just to wind up with the quotation, more and more by Professor Carol Dweck. More and more research is suggesting that far from being simply encoded in the genes, much of personality is a flexible and dynamic thing that changes over the lifespan and is shaped by experience. People in the fragile states are human. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And also thank you for the paper, which arrived just before the meeting, which is we can study that and bring out the... there might be some sort of factual questions we ask as well, because we haven't had time to see the paper. Right, Alex from USAID, and now at the Overseas Development Institute, happily celebrating its 60th birthday. Very good paper you've sent us with lots of do's and don'ts, nice and clear. We like that, but lay it out for us briefly in 5 minutes if you can.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to see old friends as well. I think that I'll just start with your articulation at the top about the sense that so much of the effort of the international community is moving into fragile states, 50% of the poorest, 50% of aid budgets by large providers. I think that the complement to that is fundamentally that working on state capacity and effectiveness in fragile states really presents a conundrum to us, which I think is a lot of what we're talking about here today. And that is that it's simultaneously the sine qua non, the thing that you cannot do without if you are going to make sustainable progress, yet it is slow, it is complicated, and it is extremely political. And when you line those three things up, that's a pretty good indication of all of the things that international support is essentially not good at doing in the main. So the urgency of these situations, particularly their tie to things like national security and other things, give us a sense of drive and ambition that things need to be done and need to be done rapidly. And yet that confronts the very situation that we're talking about, which is that capacity is limited. Politics are obviously complicated in fragile states by definition. And so there is this fundamental challenge. And yet I do think that there is recognition that progress is actually possible everywhere. There is demonstration where there has been tremendous success, and I'll give two examples and then go to a couple of lessons. I submitted to you a paper. ODI has been doing a tremendous amount of research on a number of different sectors and countries. And the thing that I think is interesting is that we do get some kind of bright lights that come out of that. Maybe not complete clarity, but then some things that really stand out. But let me just speak very briefly about experience in Afghanistan, because I witnessed something up close that I thought was dramatic and important for this discussion, which is the international community coming in, extremely high profile, a lot of resources, and you have simultaneously two test cases or many test cases side by side where you have some fantastic successes and some spectacular failures. And I think it's important for us to understand what is it that drove success in one place, failure in another, in the same place at the same time. I'll just give briefly the example of the National Basic Health Services package, because it's such an interesting example. The country had the worst statistics of anywhere in the world of under 5 infant and maternal mortality. So people are dying at alarming rates. Basically, the healthcare system has gone to virtually nothing after decades of war, and then the Taliban taking it down to nothing. And there was a critical decision made, and equally importantly, that critical decision was actually made by Afghans, that what they wanted to do to restart their health system was to get cheap, effective solutions that work everywhere, that can be delivered not only by doctors, but by people with a limited amount of training, and get them quickly to a widespread number of the population, because there are things that literally for $1 a cure make the difference between life and death. The second critical decision that they made was to say that we know that we as a government do not have the capacity to deliver that. And instead of insisting that we need to build that government capacity or we're not going to do it, what they did is they looked at what was actually already working on the ground. You had a lot of NGOs that had been for decades giving life-saving treatments around the country. And so they formed a bond together with the government being the one to do the procurement. So they were in charge. They got to set the policy, but implementation could be widespread. And the third is that, as I said, they focused on attainable results. And the results were incredible. In a decade of time, Afghan life expectancy went up 10 to 15 years. And so let me contrast that with the justice sector, which I also did a lot of work in. Same incredible amount of urgency. There's a sense that the Taliban are growing because of the lack of legitimacy of the government, inability of people to solve problems at the local level, sense of a lack of rule of law, lack of ability to get simple disputes realized. People increasingly then go to the Taliban and others to resolve those disputes when the government's not there. So it couldn't be more important in terms of what we were trying to achieve. And yet you had a government, a number of people that came in, political decision-making, that wanted to radically reform the country's justice system. We actually had an incident where an Italian Supreme Court justice was basically brought in and locked himself in a room to redraft Afghan legal codes according to their standards instead of Afghan standards, and a whole complicated series of things that happening in the same time and space, all of those important decisions that were made that recognized local existing capacity, worked with the grain, made Afghan decisions, were done completely in the opposite way in the justice sector. I don't mean to suggest that these two sectors are totally comparable, because they're not, and we can talk more about that. But I do think it's really important to see we're simultaneously these sorts of things. The second thing I just wanted to mention really briefly was the launch of Power Africa, which your government participated in as well, and other work that we were doing on trying to expand energy access. And the reason I raise that is because the thing that's so interesting about the energy sector is that energy is good business, right? You can look around London, look around most places. People like energy. They're willing to pay for it, often even in the poorest countries. It's a very good business. And it's not a problem of technology, right? We've pretty much got that figured out. So why is it when you map energy poverty and you look at the map of fragile states around the world, these things line up pretty well? And the problem is about systemic constraints. And I don't just mean all of the general enabling environment things, that's important, but particularly in fragile environments, you have a problem fundamentally of a lack of ability to do intermediation. The companies on one hand, the institutions that are meant in the government to manage and do the operations and maintenance, and the donors, they tend to be approaching different objectives, and it's a large and complicated set of problems that you need to solve. And so what the donors succeed in doing is actually building the capacity for those governments to make hard decisions along the way. But when that capacity doesn't exist, that sort of embedded support doesn't exist, then what often happens is that people make big plans. There are big amounts of monies announced in capitals like this, but we don't actually get that translating into real megawatts on the ground. And I'm happy to talk more about that in that experience. So from that, let me just throw out a few lessons. The first, as we heard from Michael at the start, it's fundamental. If there's one lesson about all of this, it is that power and politics are central. These are not technical exercises. They are social change management exercises, and if you don't embed that up front in how you design and plan and execute your program, then you're probably going to fail. The second one is that you have to come to solve problems, not to bring solutions. The amount of need is endless in fragile states. The focus should not be, well, we know that there's an endless amount of need, so we should come and introduce solutions. What you need to do is you need to identify where the political will exists. You need to identify how to actually solve a problem in that particular environment and then carry forward your program on that basis. And the third is make a difference, not grand plans. The one thing that I have seen, I have spent most of my career of 25 years working in fragile states and on fragile states. And the thing that I find remarkable is that small amounts of positive change in highly dysfunctional environments can have an incredible broadening effect, sort of an ink spot effect. Something that sometimes gets called pockets of competence in literature is that when you get some things working, it enables a broader set of things to work. So the last three lessons on what to do with that knowledge of what we've learned. The first is to work with context. It sounds like such a basic thing, and some of these things are so basic that I almost get embarrassed saying them, but at the same time, when you see how often we fail at the most basic things, it's really important to remember that. And so it is easy to say work with context, but it's actually hard to do. One of the things that we have done an enormous amount of work on at ODI with other partners is something that we call doing development differently, or thinking and working politically, which is how do you actually embed an understanding of how to do adaptive management into the aid culture, into our governments, so that we don't get stuck with big plans, but that we actually work iteratively to solve the problems. And that's critically important and has shown good results. The second, as I've already said, is to work solvable problems. When we identify problems that can actually be achieved in that context, and as Michael outlined, I think very clearly, you set metrics, you set an approach, you make sure that the people behind it are out and public about what they want to accomplish and held to account for that, you actually can get pretty far. But they have to be solvable problems as opposed to things that you just want to do but may not actually be supportable in that context. And the last one, which is I end with because it's where I begin everything that I think about development, is that you have to orient towards local ownership. We get ahead of ourselves frequently in these environments because everybody thinks that it's so important to accomplish things quickly. And in every one of those cases, if there is not local ownership, if we do not recognize the limitations of what can reasonably be done in those environments, then I believe inevitably we fail. But where that local ownership does in fact exist and we work with it over time, then we see some incredible gains that can be made.
Brilliant, thank you. You've all given us a bucket load of common sense and practical suggestions, which I think is really helpful. My co-chair, Donald Kabaruka, former Finance Minister of Rwanda, isn't here, so I'm going to abuse the process by asking one question each, just to get things going before I open up to my other commissioners. Just starting with you, Michael, just one technical point. A lot of the criticism of education programs has been it's about quality, getting people into school rather than quality. Can you say a word about that? Because I think you claim that in the Punjab, the quality has been there. The second thing is, your presentation, I mean, it's clearly been effective, but it sounds a little bit different from some of the other things we've been hearing, which it does sound quite a top-down, brought-in solution, and yet you've made it work. Have you got a sort of some mechanisms that you think work particularly well when you're trying to deliver this sort of program, the way you work with the government, the way you use independent or private sectors to deliver the places? Are there some sort of do's and don'ts for quite a top-down delivered program, which does seem to have delivered results?
Yes, I mean, it is. You're right, it's top-down, but it's not top-down brought in from outside. So it's true that I brought some expertise on how you do delivery to Punjab, but it's the Chief Minister's program. So once he engaged, everything is called the Chief Minister's Roadmap. The whole thing, if you're in Punjab, you see it as his program, and he absolutely, the last point you made, he owns it. It's his program. And the techniques of setting goals and trajectories and plans and data and routines is kind of so obvious that it will work anywhere, for sure. It worked in number 10, it works in Peru, it works in Punjab. So although it's top-down in the sense that it comes from the Chief Minister, the actual actions you take don't need to be top-down. You can... So it's built around a Prime Minister or a Chief Minister, but it's not a top-down... Right. It's not inevitably top-down.
Taking account of their politics and delivering...
Yes, and in fact, just in the last... I don't have time to go into this, but in the last year, there's been a big devolution of responsibilities to the 36 districts that I put on the map, and they're taking some leadership responsibility.
And a quality point that you can measure...
And on that, we went for enrolment, but right from the beginning, we had a quality drive. And what happened in India was they got lots of kids into school, but the quality actually dropped. I think Grant would be probably the expert on that. So you've seen the drop in that. But in Punjab, we saw quality as part of getting people enrolled. So parents would use the schools if their children were going to learn something. So we've monitored quality all the way through, and it took a while. But in the last 2 years, we've seen the quality rising alongside enrolment rising. Right. And it's to do with consciously having both those things in your head, not just enrolment, but both together.
Thank you.
One other point. The government is the funder and regulator, but it isn't the sole provider. So we've used private sector NGO providers of schools. So last year, we outsourced 5,000 schools. Which were the lowest performing schools in Punjab. They've already improved in a year, but the government remains the funder, so it's free at the point of view to the child, and the government...
You would argue that's made the expansion
that
made it easier to deliver.
It's easier to deliver, and actually I think there's a generalisable thing for state policy, not just on education, about states seeing itself as a regulator and funder, but not the sole provider. I think government as a monopoly provider is generally a problem in the developing world.
Sanjeev, your paper, very clear relationship between exiting fragility and improving fiscal capacity. I don't know whether you can say anything about the causation one way or the other. But the other question I had on your paper, the thing that really strikes you is that the difference between fragile states and non-fragile states is not so much the income tax, which I thought it would be, but actually the tax on the goods and services. So I've got a really obvious sort of simple question, which is to explain a bit from the IMF perspective, the difficulties that these countries have in terms of imposing taxes on goods and services so they can have less tax on trade, which is obviously damaging for them, and income taxes which take perhaps longer to bring in. Can you explain a bit about what works and what doesn't as countries examine this very difficult area of taxing goods and services?
So let me pick up the first point that you raised about why is that some countries succeed and others don't. Yeah. I think clearly the points have come in here. Ownership is absolutely crucial because some countries, whatever advice and assistance they get, they used it effectively. And then you start seeing some results. And then there are others because of some internal conflicts and other things, are not able to make use of that advice, and things fizzle out over time. And that has been an experience. I gave the example of South Sudan, Yemen. You can think of Afghanistan. I mean, we've been present there for a very, very long time, and there is not much. We've achieved something, but not so much more. And so the other issue that you raised is a bit more substantive as to why you're not able to put in more complex tax systems in fragile states, for the reasons that I mentioned at the beginning, which is their capacity to run those systems is extremely weak. And so value-added tax or taxation on other types of goods and services is harder. So you look for simpler things like collecting taxes at the border, because you just need to put in some people there and collect the money, and all the things which are being imported, the revenue is collected. Of course, that's not the best thing that you want to have. And then similarly, income tax requires some systems. Initially, you may decide that for the organized sector to have withholding for the people in the organized sector, but then it gives you some income, but not too much. So if you are looking to deal with the issues of equity, which is what income tax will end up doing, you don't really have the system, and in the stage where the country has just emerged from a conflict or for a disaster. Take the case of Haiti and some other countries like that. So I think, but if I may add something to what was discussed in Michael's remarks, we are now doing a lot of work on digital technologies in public finance. And I think there is scope for a number of countries to leapfrog.
Yes.
And in provision of services and collection of taxes. So we are producing a book which should be out soon. And we ran a big conference with the Gates Foundation. And so, for example, on education, we found the surveys that have shown that the new technologies are able to provide much better services in education than in case of health, if one looks across the range of countries where these services have been provided. On the taxation side, there are a lot of challenges, but can you use, for example, IBM is telling us there is a blockchain technology which can be used and is being used in the UK for delivery of pensions. If we can use some of the things like that at the border in some of the countries, that will reduce the cost of collecting taxes quite sharply. So the point is that we should be looking in these countries as well about the possibility of introducing new technologies, because this could make a big difference.
It's like jumping straight to internet banking.
Yeah.
You jump to a digital tax system fast and you don't go through the stages.
Because you have in Africa 600 million people with mobile phones. Can we use them like in Kenya?
Thank you. If I could, as you were at the sharp end of this, perhaps you could tell us about, first of all, what happened to the tax take in Nigeria in terms of percentage of GDP, and how much you felt running the organization that other countries, other tax organizations, NGOs or others could actually help. Were there useful things they did that did help you in your work? And the remark you made about the IMF about saying sometimes you felt that there was a prescription from only one template. Maybe you could give a bit more detail about what you felt about that.
All right, thank you. I think in terms of, I don't have the figures at my fingertips. Now, there's percentage of GDP before the change in the GDP figures, because we were...
revised.
Yes, it was revised.
Yeah.
But it improved by, I think, 3 or 4 percentage points, percentage of GDP. But with the revision, it went down again because there was a reclassification of the GDP. Now, in terms of support from NGOs and other bodies, when talking about the involvement of stakeholders, it involved everyone. But I would say that the NGO community helped only to a limited extent in terms of raising awareness, because there weren't really that many NGOs that were focused on helping to ensure that tax awareness was raised. In fact, one of the suggestions I had made was that I was looking forward to an NGO that will actually continue the whole issue of ensuring that on their own, without the FRS driving it, ensuring that people were paying their taxes, reporting, which was an issue, reporting cases where the FRS was not doing what it should be doing. Very few people are willing to actually come out to say this is what FRS need to do better, because they feel that they'll be victimized if they come out, because they're looking at their own self-protection. And so that's still a gap, in terms of...
There wasn't enough there was NGO pressure on other things, but not enough on the issue of tax avoidance, tax evasion, tax transparency.
Not enough. And part of the reason is they didn't understand it. And so when we talk about tax being actually now front burner, it was when they now started realizing what the tax system was all about. So there's actually more NGO on the expenditure side, but very, very not as much on the revenue generation side, and actually ensuring you have a good tax system. Now, in terms of having the issue of a one template, because of all the, let me expand on that a little bit. And let me even just use the presentation of Sanjeev on the study that was done on fragile states. And there could be a tendency of a listener to look at the study that's done and generalize and feel that, all fragile states are necessary in that same corner. There's a tendency for that. But if you look at the Nigerian situation, Nigeria is quite more complicated than a Ghana. Or more complicated than other states. One, in terms of the sheer population. Two, in terms of the sheer number of ethnic groups. You could be in a city, the next door person, you don't understand his language. In terms of the sheer issues with the educational system and the lack of infrastructure, and the fact that in spite of all this, a lot of wealth has accrued to Nigeria, unlike quite a number of fragile states. And therefore, what have we done with the wealth has also complicated the situation. And so in that sense, yes, a lot of advice is necessary. A lot of the studies are important, but it's always good to customize it to your own peculiar situation. And so rather than just taking what you get, but processing it and saying to yourself, what aspect would you take, what aspect would you customize, what will work now as opposed to what will work later.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Alex, just one question for you. It's really to explain a bit. You were very straightforward and said, you've got to find solvable problems, local ownership, don't overpromise, it was all very focused on common sense. But I just wanted you to explain a little bit more in your note. Internalize and operationalize that capacity development is ultimately about fostering social and political change. I want to explain what you mean by that. Do you mean that in the end you have to enable governments to deliver and prove that they've delivered? Is that what you're saying? I wanted a bit in sort of plain English about what you're saying needs to be done differently.
Yeah. Well, so I think that the first thing, although it's not entirely new, there has been in the last couple of years a sort of re-revolution in the thinking about political economy analysis, and that essentially when people are looking at large-scale aid programs, the first thing you need to do is to understand that the political context that you're working in, to understand that it is a political context, and then to incorporate that not only into your thinking about how do you approach the problem? How do you get into it? Who are the players? Where are the barriers? Where are you likely to meet success, failure? But then incorporate mechanisms that enable you to work in a complex environment into how you approach working on a program. So the worst example of that is that people come in and they say, here's a problem that needs to be resolved. We see this, there's a strong references, particularly in security sector reform, in papers that we have done, reviews that DFID and others have done, that essentially show that over and over people say, well, okay, obviously we need to come and train police and soldiers how to march and shoot straight, and we're going to put a lot of money into that, and we're going to set up their structures. And those things tend to be apolitical in their thinking, not realizing about how you are playing into all of the dynamics, particularly in a fragile environment, factional politics and all of those sorts of things, and also what it is that's going to make those sustainable. There's fiscal sustainability problems. Those things tend to be enormously expensive, but also how do you manage the leadership? And as a result, they often fail and are unsustainable and often end up contributing more to the problems. I mean, we've all gotten wrapped on governments have gotten wrapped on the knuckles for doing terrible things, and the people we train end up going on to do terrible things. And so having awareness of that context and building that into your thinking in advance about what you should do, how do you engage, that's the first part of it. But then the second part, which is in many ways even more challenging but critical, is to actually develop mechanisms in how we work to be able to see what's happening and to adjust over time to be able to make the changes in terms of what we see on the ground. And so there's a couple of challenges there. One is data. Where do you get the information that is not strictly numbers of children vaccinated or butts in seat in school, but actually getting you to know where you're really meeting those challenges when there's a change of a minister or another person? How do you know where you've gone up and down, where the networks behind the networks are actually moving things forward or backwards? So you need to be able to understand how that context is evolving and to embed that into how you move forward in your program. The second thing is that you need to then have the mechanisms. I mean, this is something I can say from USAID. I've done a lot of work with DFID. It's true for the other major donors. What do? We set out a program. We do this big, heavy design. We go out and procure it. It then goes to a contractor to implement. They've got some framework that says the 90 things that they need to do. They go off and do that. They report back to it. It is not a flexible structure. Yeah. It does not allow for the people, the smart people that you've got on the ground to be able to say, wait a minute, something's changing here. I need to change something critical about how this program is operating. Someone will say, oh, well, it's already been procured and designed. And so we actually need to have flexible ways of working so that as we understand this context and respond to what's happening, we can actually build that into how we operate.
Got it. Local, flexible, all things we're hearing this morning. Very helpful. Right, now who wants to dive in with questions and points? Let's start with you. You fire away to whoever you want to.
So you mentioned hiring on merit, and that means at some point some people were moved out of their jobs, and that was true certainly of the schools, where you replaced a lot of them with non-governmental organizations run schools. And I was curious about how you handled the pushback. Surely that was not an uncontroversial thing to do.
It's true, and it's quite true, but it's very, very important. So if you've got 36 districts run by officials who are there because they're a friend of some local politician, they're not going to be able to sort the problems out. And if they turn over 4 times a year, you never get any consistency. So you have to tackle it. In the end, the chief minister, he had to decide to do that. He got quite a lot of pushback in his own political party. They said, but this is how we do politics. And he said, no. We're moving from the politics of patronage to the politics of performance. And if we're going to do the politics of performance, we have to appoint people on merit. He set up an official committee that made these appointments, and he dealt with the politics. I didn't see that, but he dealt with it. And I think you have to do that. And then similarly on teacher transfers, which had been for years, but Adnan knows about this, but you have to take it on. And again, he got a lot of pushback. So that's why political leadership really matters. It's very hard to do these things if somebody local who owns the solution doesn't want to take that on. There's only so much you can do as an outsider coming in on those. But the chief minister, to his great credit, took on those issues and dealt with them. And when people were removed from post on lack of merit, they weren't actually totally fired. They were put in some far-flung corner of the bureaucracy where they didn't do much damage. That's the truth, but that's not unusual.
The solution was locally owned. I mean,
yes, absolutely locally owned. And when incidentally, his party won the 2013 election in Punjab, 2014 election, they won easily, and then the local politicians saw what the politics of performance could do for electoral prospects, because now they were winning because they were providing better transport, better health, better education.
Adnan.
So I have a few questions, maybe I can ask one go. So first question is on authorization and sustainability to Sir Michael and Ifueko. So you both had like strong authorization, you had a blank sheet, you were working with CM, but both are rarities. So partly the question is, CM Punjab is rare in Punjab and low in what do you do when you don't have, and what do you do to ensure more sustainability? But more importantly, in case of Sir Michael, so those reforms based on systems, IT, and targets may work for some time, so there's a strong leader at some time. But in order to be sustainable, you need change in institution, change in agent behavior, change in also emergence of local practices where people take advantage of local institutional context and develop their own solutions. And the challenge is, as some would see, like focus on the first set of reform, they constrain the space, suck the oxygen for the second set of reform, which are perhaps more important in the long run for sustainability. My question to Mr. Sanjeev is, given that tax performance is a function not just of tax instruments used, but also of enforcement and voluntary compliance, and how much does the poor performance persistent poor performance of fragile states and poor countries on tax performance warrant a change of approach both by the IMF and World Bank and by developing countries themselves? By the IMF in the sense of a move away from an exclusive focus on say efficiency, in the sense that some loss of efficiency in instruments used may be justified by say by the revenue gain and the trust gain in the process, and by the governments in allowing them more space in building local solutions that allow for this interaction between trust and legitimacy in the state. So taxes being more transparently used for services and legitimacy. At the same time, also enforcement of the state, which allow them to take on more complicated, more efficient systems. Last question to Alex. So the two examples that you mentioned from Afghanistan on health and justice were illuminating, but they're also very different in terms of like the type of services and so health, at least those primary healthcare gains in the terminology of maybe land would be one would call them like one of the logistic problem where simple solutions or simple practices are possible. Whereas criminal justice system is a very, in its terminology, maybe a wicked hard system where you have like high transaction intensity, but also like norm standards and a number of other things are also like need to be defined. And I wanted to get your both sense of like how do you begin to tackle more of the questions of the latter type and any successful example.
Okay, Michael.
I'll be very brief. So on the second point you made about local ownership, the beauty, and maybe I didn't get this across, of the delivery approach that we're using in Punjab and I've seen in other places, is that it isn't a solution, it's a process for getting at solutions, but the solutions come from the local people, the Chief Minister. And when we have a stock take of the health progress, there are maybe 70 or 80 people in the room, they can all chip in and you get solutions, and it's like real live drama. I call it the best show in Lahore, actually. It's really very vibrant, and I've helped them put the process in place and the data that informs the debate and the plain speaking, so telling it how it really is. But they're driving solutions. I looked around the room in the health stock take when I was there 4 weeks ago. There were at least 20 or 30 people who I just thought, I know these people know how to do this now. That is capacity building. They've got the capacity to deliver now. And the data and the routines aren't an imposed solution. They're the enablers of finding solutions to any problem. So that is a really important distinction. On the chief minister, if you don't have, Shahbaz Sharif is unusually talented political leader, very committed, very passionate. But nevertheless, first of all, you do have to find some political. If you can't find any political leadership, it's very hard to do anything. So in Sindh province in Pakistan, I remember when you came. They were asking, could we do the same thing in Sindh? And we were basically saying, and we put it more politely than this, but no, because the Chief Minister is corrupt and there's no way we can work with him. He doesn't want to do anything different. That's just changed recently. But in KP, they have a less effective government, but they've adopted the data system that we had for Punjab's education system, and it has made a significant difference. So you can model success. And I think in a place like Pakistan, if you can make something work in one province, in the end, a bit of competitive pressure on the others makes them say, well, we can't let Punjab get too far ahead or whatever. So if you've got any serious political leadership, they will follow. And I think the key, which Alex also emphasised, of demonstrating success is really important.
Thank you. Sanjeev, I think it's probably you next.
Yes. Two issues that you raised about weak enforcement of tax systems in fragile states. One of the characteristics of these states is that they tend to have higher perception of corruption as compared to other countries. And when you relate the corruption perception indexes with, let's say, time taken to clear imports, the time taken to give VAT refunds, you find that countries which are more corrupt, they take much longer to do that. So the clearance of imports takes much, much longer when the incidence of corruption is higher. So the point is that we recognize that corruption is a big issue in some of those states. So you need to come up with simple second best or third best solutions. It doesn't have to be first best. We know that. But things that will work to start with until the country has moved to a stage where it is a lot more stable and ready to adopt more complex plans. The danger lies that in many of the places, because of some pressures from donors and from countries themselves, they start to look for more modern systems, which they're not ready for. I think that's a pressure that we have to withstand. And so I think I agree with you that we have to place less emphasis on efficiency in the initial stages and go more for something which will work.
Thank you. I think, actually, Ifueko, there was a question for you as well.
Yes, I think on sustainability. I think, first of all, I'll fast-track automation and embed it within the system in such a way that it's difficult to reverse. So automating the processes and the linkages, and doing it, as quickly as possible, I think will help in, sustainability. I think secondly is consciously thinking about succession planning. I think that's something we didn't do. To actually think about it, build it in, factor it in, and then discuss with those who make the political decisions, and ensuring as much as possible they understand why it's important, and regardless of how they want the process to be, to ensure that those principles that would drive succession are built into the decision-making process.
Alex, the difference between justice and healthcare, and is it a fair comparison?
It is not a fair comparison about the complexities of getting things done in the sectors, but it is a fair comparison of approaches and how different approaches can yield fundamentally different results. Let me answer your question. So the problem with the justice sector, actually, instead of thinking, I think it partially stems from it, instead of thinking of the justice sector as this gigantic, enormous problem, the reality is what people needed was simple disputes resolved. And that is actually something that is delivered, and the failure of the government to deliver it meant somebody else was coming in or they weren't being delivered. So it's, it's the simple things. Someone ran over my cow. Where's the line between my property and your property? Also, including more violent things, but societies always have ways of dealing with these. I was part of a project that produced a book a couple of years ago looking at state and non-state justice systems in post-conflict societies. And the conclusion coming out of that is that where there was the most success in dealing with dispute resolution, which is probably among one of the most fundamental aspects of what a justice system actually needs to do in a divided society at the local level, it was those cases where people tended to embrace looking at how problems are actually solved in that society at the local level, and then thinking how to bring together formal and informal approaches, not to just say, oh, leave it be, the tribal elders or whatever can resolve it, but actually to say, how do we meet somewhere here, because there is real capacity to solve problems. It is possible to do that, but we can't come up with a state system. In fact, what was happening in Afghanistan is often the case. They said, not only do we not want to work with that system, but we need to eradicate the system that is currently in place to impose a new system that looks like what you would find if you walk down the road here instead of what makes sense in an Afghan or a Liberian village. There are several cases, Liberia, Guatemala, the Gacaca process in Rwanda, where people actually kind of morphing state and non-state mechanisms together to embrace what's working in the non-state, but not wholly, because there are needs to protect rights and things like that, is where you actually do get reasonable outcomes in fragile environments, in things like dispute resolution and low-level justice issues, which make a huge difference.
Yeah. Ask people what they want before putting the solution in place. Right, I've got Paul and Tim. We're going to come in together, and then you're going to come in.
Thank you. Questions to Ifueko. I remember talking with you just after you'd taken your job on, and one of the things I remember is that you'd taken an 85% salary cut in order to take the job. So that, in a way, gave you a lot of credibility. And I want to take you back to that time when you're just coming into the job. And as you say, you basically were brought in from outside on top of an organisation which was sort of mired in cynicism and pessimism. And you could have tried to get out of that with two different routes, two different models, as it were. And I just wanted to present a choice of what you actually went for. So one model is the sort of, if you like, the Weberian bureaucracy, which is the idea of the impartial professional. So you can move from that sort of cynical, corrupt, despairing environment to, no, you're all a group of professionals. The professional tax collectors, there's a global model of what a professional tax collector does, and the norms that you need are impartial professionals. So that's one sort of idea, the impartial international tax professional. Then the other is what you might call the mission-driven cadre, and the norms of the mission-driven cadre, where you say what you're about is building a stronger revenue base to make a stronger Nigeria. We've got to have that revenue in order to be able to do things, and that's the mission, and you're a key instrument in that mission, and you get a team around that, motivated by that mission. So these are different approaches. I mean, you can try and sort of blend them or something, but to caricature it, the British tax inspector, when he goes to work in the morning, isn't really, on the whole, driven by the thought, I'm building a stronger Britain. They're basically thinking, I'm
enforcing the law, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm adhering to the standards of impartial professionalism. I'm proud of that. Whereas in China, the tax inspector goes to work each morning. What am I doing? I'm a core mission-driven agent of building a strong China. So it's a question, you can do either of these, but it's just a question, what do you go for, and what would you recommend? And using the distinction sensible.
Sure, but maybe before I answer that question, looking from the outside in, what did you think I went for?
I'll tell you at the end.
Okay. Again, putting the context in place. Just like you said, a lot of cynicism, a lot of pessimism, feeling of being neglected, and everybody just taking care of themselves, so to speak. It's a tough question to answer because it's neither one or the other, at least in the context that I faced at that time. The impartial professional is a desired model where you have the people in place, and you're building on the skills, and you have the infrastructure to actually, because the impartial professional doesn't operate in a vacuum. He has the working tools, he has the technology systems to enable him do that work. And he's also very well paid, so to speak, at least relative to his colleagues. And also contrast that with a situation where there was no money, people were using their personal salaries to actually print tax forms. You had offices that, in fact, people were actually hiding their tax badges and not wanting to even be recognized as FRS staff in the public amongst their friends. And that's why, for me, the decision was both. One, enabling me to buy time. So first of all, building a sense of awareness that it was something to do, because we needed to bring people to be on the same page, and for people to even understand what we were even trying to do. And that's why that whole sense of we're trying to do Nigeria, in fact, at times actually bringing it home to whatever money you're collecting, you're helping somebody go to hospital. You're helping some, so there needed to be that, why am I doing this? Now, again, context. I entered the service where 80-90% of the people that were recruited were either passengers or drivers or didn't have the required qualification to do anything. That needed to be reversed. By the time I ended in 8 years, after 8 years, we had reversed that, where 80% were people with the right qualifications. But we're just about getting now to them, start training and putting in place the right infrastructure to put it in place. So I think it depends on what you find, would be my answer. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all kind of approach, and we chose to do both. One was to buy time, one was to get everybody on board as much as possible, because again, you probably may have understood there's a lot of resistance, a lot of opposition. So it was, in fact, at times I could describe the situation as actually fighting a war and just trying to always be ahead so that you keep focused on your agenda. So in the case of FRS, it was both, starting with the mission, but at the back of one's mind, knowing that you need to build a professional core, and that's what we did.
Okay. Thank you. Tim? I'll do two more questions, then we're probably going to break for lunch, then we'll come back and open it up.
Okay, I have sort of two separate lines of questions. I'll just ask one now, and then you can adjudicate on the time. First one is to Alex and Michael. I guess one of the things you hear regularly is that part of the way of trying to build state capacity is to recognize the value of decentralizing decision-making and looking for local solutions. And that often within countries requires not having a one-size-fits-all, even within a country. And of course that has the benefit. So in your example, Michael, for Punjab, you could work with a chief minister who is intending reform, whereas other parts of Pakistan didn't have that benefit. Now, you kind of described the race to the top, the possibility now that other provinces in Pakistan are going to look at the success of Punjab and start to say, well, we can do some of that. But you can imagine that playing out in a very different way, which says that this pesky state is causing all sorts of problems for us because now people are kind of complaining that we're not delivering. And I can't think of a surefire example of a race to the bottom, but you can imagine a scenario in which actually success is snuffed out because there's too much opposition from other places. But I guess I'm more generally interested in the question of is there a way, a diagnostic, in some way we can think about the right way to go about, first of all, identifying where decentralization is the solution in practice. Is it just, we take advantage of there's a good political leader in one area, we just chase that. But I feel sometimes the decentralized solution is rather facilely the solution. I guess I want you to help us think through that.
Great. Michael first, and then Alex.
First of all, there are no guarantees in this. So, Punjab is 100 million people. If Punjab is a whole lot better, it would be great if the other provinces moved as well. But if they don't move, I'm still happy that 100 million people in Punjab have a better life. So you can't guarantee that it will lead to a race to the top, in my words, or race to the bottom if some other circumstances apply there. These are uncertain things. But I do think demonstrating for Pakistan and beyond in a big province like Punjab that you can do big progress on health, education and water is well worth doing, and it's ameliorating the lives of people immediately. The second thing I'll say is, when you build capacity, I think there's far too much in the kind of development world talking about building capacity of a kind of generic kind, whereas when you set some goals, you build the capacity to deliver that outcome, then it gets much more specific. So once you've got, I've put measurable outcomes in education, we've got similar ones in health or water. You're then building the capacity of the system to deliver those outcomes, and that's more specific, more targeted, more contextual, and more local. So I think building capacity needs to be specific. And when we went out into what I'd call the delivery chain beyond Lahore, we were training people to do that task, whatever it happened to be. Clean hospitals better, outsource schools that are low performing, make sure everybody's got textbooks, whatever it might be. So I think training to specifically is much better than generic capacity building, of which there's too much. And then on decentralization, I think the key thing is to not just think about centralization or decentralization, but think in detail, what do you centralize and what do you decentralize, and how does that change over time? So be very specific about the tasks. We've just done this decentralization of health and education in Punjab, or when I say we, the Chief Minister's done it. But we're very, very specific that the roadmap for health and education, which involves getting data in real time to Lahore, that will not be put at risk. So that's a very specific thing, because the whole thing would collapse without the data systems. So you have to be very, I think we need to get into much more specificity about what you decentralize and what you don't, and how that changes over time.
I think that point about the difference between capacity, as described by aid agencies and experts and others, and actually the ability to deliver, they are two sometimes quite different things. That, you know, you can look at capacity, the scale of a tax-raising operation, or the scale and capabilities of an education department. But the ability to deliver is, you know, if a Prime Minister or Minister in situation A wants to do B, C and D, are they actually capable of getting it done? Is there a connection? You know, people think that in first world countries there's sort of, you know, you pull a lever and there's a wire connected to it and something happens. And very often it's not the case. And Michael's insight to all this is that it's no good building capacity unless actually there's processes in that capacity for political leaders to make change happen. And I do think that needs to play a part in our thinking. So I interrupted. I shouldn't do that, Alex.
No.
The last point, and then we're going to break for we're going to keep time, and we'll come back to you straight after lunch.
I would just reinforce that by saying that I think that you need to think about four things: principles, policy, clarity, and implementation. Because the ways in which you do want there to be principles about what it is you're trying to achieve. And those, I think, need to be held and guided at a higher level. The policy that is then put in place in order to achieve that is something that then recognizes where do you want to actually have the ability to make that change? Who gets to make those decisions about policy decisions? And that leads to the clarity question, because I think one of the problems that we often face in fragile states, because they are divided societies, is that there is fundamentally a tension between center and periphery. And so who holds the decision-making power, who gets the resources in order to do that, is constantly something that's contested. And so if you don't do some work in actually figuring out where that authority might lay and where you actually want the implementation to occur, I think you do often end up with an unhelpful set of tensions and clarity. And then the last thing is about the actual capacity to get things done. And I think that what we learn over and over again is that is generally, again, almost by definition in these environments, a highly localized capacity. And so if you can sort those first three things out, you then are free to figure out where is it best to actually implement, where are you going to get the success. But if you don't sort those three things out, that's where you end up with what is often a muddled system, where you have a central government wanting to set all the policy, wanting to control all the capacity, but not having the ability to implement. And then not only do you get non-implementation, but you get negative implementation, which reinforces the disaffection with the government, the lack of the government's legitimacy, and the whole thing goes around in circles.
Thank you. Right, we're going to come back here at 1:45 for I don't know how long we'll we got till 3:15, but I'm not sure we'll need all that time, but that's for people to chip in and ask more questions and we get more points. We're going to have a lunch with our witnesses, and that's the commissioners. I'm afraid everyone else is going to have to grab something in the canteen or outside, and we meet back here at 1:45. Thank you very much. The next question was Robin, so you're going to fire away. And then I'll take questions from anyone else who wants to contribute. But I think you'll probably be able to wrap this session up relatively quickly. You're all very busy people. You've given great evidence, very clear answers to questions. But let's have a bit of rapid fire.
So, sorry, a question for Ifueko and Michael, which is, the literature on political leaders and society shows that in weaker states, leadership changes lead to more changes in economic performance and administrative economics and state capacity. So at some level, a measure of state capacity is that not much changes when the leader changes. You know, that's a mature, well-developed state. So my question was, one thing that I found lacking was the discussion of the role of the bureaucracy. So in the case of Nigeria changing the president, changing the Pakistan, changing the chief minister, how can you use the bureaucracy or training the bureaucracy to kind of lock in some state capacity so that when there is a leadership change, it ultimately will be, to ensure that there's some, we don't have a complete collapse in economic performance.
Okay, I think
do you have any concrete suggestions?
One for Ifueko and then Michael. Because I think a lot of the international community's answer to every problem is training, but training only works if it is accompanied by changes in culture and leadership and political will.
I agree that the bureaucracy is very important. Again, in the case of Nigeria, the same situation that I found in the FRS is really where the bureaucracy is. You have what I'll call islands of very, very competent people who are fired up. And you have quite a number of people who are pessimistic, who feel they are neglected, recognized. So I think, first of all, and I know that over the years, different presidents have tried at one point or the other to do what they call civil service reform to ensure this is done. But it's always petered out. It's never been sustained. It's never been done for long enough. And then again, it's the same 1 step forward, 5 step back. The same thing that I talked about, generally. So it's not, what I discussed earlier is the bureaucracy is just a part of that as well.
Okay, Mike.
Just 3 points. One is, as you say, you hear a lot about training, but as I was saying before lunch, it's training to do specific roles is much more likely to really build skills as opposed to generic training. And I think that's important right down and out through a delivery chain. The second is when a leader changes. So in 2018 there'll be an election in Punjab. It's possible Shahbaz Sharif won't be the chief minister after that. There's now sufficient capable bureaucracy to sustain that momentum for a while. If you've got a really poor leader, that would dissipate after a while. Because what you see, as we were talking about over lunch, is good leaders bring the good bureaucrats out of the background. They come out of the shadows. They start doing things. If you get a bad leader, the good leaders vanish off to do work in the private sector, go to some other province or whatever it is. So that there's only so much you can do. But if you can get enough capacity in a bureaucracy, they can sustain momentum through a mediocre leader or a kind of okay leader. If you get a really bad leader, it will you'll go into a downward spiral quite quickly. The other way to get capacity is which David and I were talking about over lunch is in some areas government can be the regulator and funder, but it doesn't have to be the monopoly provider. So it might, in a bureaucracy it probably does, but if you get into a school system or a healthcare system or a water system, the government should be setting the standards and enforcing the regulations. It should be funding so that schools are free at the point of use, but it doesn't have to be the sole provider. And then that way you can bring in capacity without losing government control.
Thank you. Nora.
I have a question for Mrs. Ifueko. I mean, you mentioned something very important, or I did with about, which is corruption. And you mentioned that sometimes you don't need to hit corruption, face on, and I've seen this in other parts of the world, if you come in and you say that you want to tackle corruption and you want to eliminate corruption, whatever the sector is, you get a lot of resistance to change, and you get a lot of, a lot of threats, a lot of issues that will actually hinder you from doing any sort of progress. And as you mentioned, you didn't tackle it head on, but you did a lot of things that would, at the end, eliminate the need for people to be corrupt or, increasing the wages of civil servants and so on. So, from your experience in that area in specific, can you shed any more light on how to deal with when there is corruption, yet you need to do other stuff in a certain organization or sector?
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I think you've summarized it very well. Let me add that because of the nature of corruption, it's very deep, it's extremely overwhelming, and if you really want to achieve a very clear agenda that brought you there in the first instance, you really can't tackle just corruption. I think in terms of tips, one is being very focused on that agenda. Two is still communicating, even if you're not tackling corruption head on, that you have a zero tolerance for corruption and actually show it in so many different ways. So, for example, one very major angle of corruption beyond the tax system in public services procurement. And very, very many people were actually shocked that anytime they came to meet me to help in influencing procurement, I deliberately took a stand that I will not be part of procurement and that they needed to put in place the processes. Even now, people say, oh, you must be stupid, you must be this, you must be that. So it's really just staying focused on your agenda, knowing very well that no matter what you do, corruption will fight back. And you have to choose which battles you want to fight and be very selective in how you deal with corruption, even as you move on in pursuing your agenda.
Thank you. Right. Let's open up to...
I want to say about capacity building.
Working?
Is it working?
It's for recording purposes. We can hear you perfectly well anyway. Thanks. Okay.
I want to ask that how shall we keep the capacity in the country? When we are seeing that in fragile states, actually people who are getting the capacity, they're going out of the country whenever they're getting opportunities. How, in your experience, you have been able to keep that capacity in the country? That's one question. And the other question is that sometimes there's a conflict between NGOs and the government in terms of who gets the best people. Generally, NGOs have more money than the government to pay, so NGOs have better capacity than the government. And when the government tries to bring these people and give them higher salaries in the government, that creates a conflict between the people who are entering the government with higher salary and people who already worked, though their capacity was low, but it kind of undermines their effort, and that creates a tension in the bureaucracy. How do you deal with those situations?
Alex, that's probably one for you. I mean, very good experience of that in Afghanistan, of the sort of, white Land Rover syndrome of people swanning around in their white Toyotas with large NGO salaries, and the government itself isn't improving. How unfair is that?
I mean, it's an enormous problem, the brain drain that comes first with the local environment, the World Bank, NGOs, United Nations, hiring people at far higher salaries than government can afford, pulls good people out of government, and then obviously there's other problems with fragility that just causes people to leave and search for other opportunities. Both of those are, I think, enormously complicated. I've seen a couple of things tried in Afghanistan and a couple other places to deal with that, which are quite interesting. One thing is that you establish embedded units. So instead of saying the United Nations is going to pay fantastic rents, which they do, for a building somewhere and hire all of these people, that what you instead do is say, if we're going to set up a unit to work on this thing, we are actually going to embed it in the ministry. We're going to invest, which is often necessary, in building up the physical space of the offices of the ministry and spending the money to wire the ministry and give it the telecommunications, etc., capability, instead of spending all that money on the offices, and then to embed those people as well within the institution, giving them more of a feeling that they're tied to the institution and more of the direction coming from local leadership instead of international leadership. It's not a perfect solution because you still often have what's called the second civil service, where people are paid much more than what you would earn. But at least it's an acknowledgement that if you're going to be in these environments, spending a lot of money on rents, capability, salaries, that you should do that to an end of building capacity
yeah.
while you're doing that instead of extracting it.
Okay. Lady at the back?
I think everyone can hear me.
Yep.
My name is Aida. I'm from Bosnia, and we have quite the opposite. We have best people working actually in NGOs, while people getting through political networks into the government, and they're not performing well. And the question is actually how to make the government then perform better and to improve the situation of the NGOs, because post-Yugoslav state, the Balkan region, where we have this kind of weak NGO, weak civil society, it was just kind of, inherited from the Yugoslav period. Still, everyone expects the government to do best. And it's kind of question is like how to strengthen, how to get more funding for the NGOs because they do a really good job, and how to make the government, the civil servants, better performing, or I don't know, if you want a more meritocratic employment or so.
Who wants to take that one on? Probably it's you again, Alex. I suppose you've got some expertise in the Balkan area.
Well, I can't actually speak so much to the Bosnian experience, but I think that the creating avenues for good people to serve in government is often a real differentiator, and you see young people who are excited to go into government versus that being a last opportunity or something that's only available to people if they have relatives in government. Shortly after 9/11, I was part of a commission that was set up to look at how do we approach Afghanistan. And one of the most interesting things was that there was a recommendation in there to invest in a civil service academy, to start the process of making it so that good people, young people who come from outside would have an avenue into government. And when we presented this recommendation and with a 3-year time frame, we were initially told, well, it's too long for the investment.
Now it's 20th anniversary, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I do think that it is a longer-term challenge, I think, in all of our countries, frankly, of thinking about how to make sure that the best and brightest feel like government service is the way to go. But I think particularly in environments like we've been talking about today, where people feel that it's corruption and other things that determine who gets the positions, whether you can succeed in that position, that are going to determine whether it's worthwhile doing that job.
Okay, Paul?
Yes, this question is Sanjeev. It's probably a very unfair one, but it's really about the appropriate skill sets within fiscal affairs for fragile states. And let me put forward a proposition that may well be completely false. Right? When I think of fiscal affairs, I think of you know an awful lot about tax. You are the world's repository of tax expertise. And that is enormously useful for the countries that, as it were, need to design a less distortionary tax system and so on. But in fragile states, as you yourself you start with really simple taxes. The problem is not designing the tax system in a way, it's building an organization of effective tax administration, and whether that requires a different skill set, one that doesn't have as much expertise on the fiscal design, but has more expertise on the organizational change, and whether that would be a sort of fair comment, both about fiscal affairs, by extension, about the specialist units within the international financial organizations that provide the technical support. Is it more appropriately designed at the moment for the sort of more top end of the fragile?
It's a good question, and I think, as I said earlier, first of all, we don't only have tax expertise, we also have same kind of expertise on the expenditure side. So you're absolutely right that what is needed in fragile states is very different for kind of issues we discuss. Sometimes we go to the advanced countries and we have meetings and we discuss the international taxation issues. That skill set is different. But we do have people in the department who've been going for years to Central African Republic, to Yemen, they know the issues, they know the countries very well, and they understand what works in these countries, but they should also know what works in other countries, because they should not be recommending that to Yemen and to Afghanistan. So the point I'm making is we need people who understand range of issues, but they must be able to adapt that advice to fragile states, and which they do very well. Actually, our guys are quite effective in going to all these places. So.
Thank you. I've got two questions up here, one at the back and one over here.
Thank you so much for the excellent presentations. I noticed in all of them some fundamental incompatibilities, however, with the way that donors prefer to deliver aid and the types of things that they prefer to support. Certainly the way that the direction of travel we're seeing in terms of donor engagement in fragile states. So what would top your wish list in terms of the ways that donors could engage more effectively in supporting local effectiveness, and what would you wish to see in terms of behavior change?
Great question. I'm going to add to it. Are there any radical changes that you want to see? I'm going to let me throw out some examples. Should we increase budget support or end budget support and give money indirectly? Should we change the rules for what counts as aid, so more could be done, for instance, on security, or should we not? Should we have greater conditionality, because fragility is related to states' ability to deal with things? Maybe there needs to be more conditionality for them to focus on. So all those questions, as well as the incompatibility between what donors want and what you think countries need, now is the moment to sort of say you should be putting on the table more radical ideas. Sorry to hijack your question, but let's put everyone on the spot quickly for a one-sentence answer to that, or just briefly to that.
Yeah, so I think that the important recognition and innovation that came from the New Deal on fragile states coming out of Busan was fundamentally the point that conditionality actually should be part of a grand bargain, where donors for their side need to be better coordinated and better integrated. I mean, how many of us, or you've experienced personally, you see the line of the Japanese, the Germans, the United States sitting outside the officer of the Minister of Finance, each of them waiting for their individual meeting to go in, and then that person just spends all of their time dealing with the international community. And so you need to have greater consolidation of action. But I think part of the exchange for that has to be a recognition that that the issues that we are trying to resolve with these big packages of support are fundamentally political issues, and the government has to acknowledge that. They have to be willing to commit to change, and if they aren't, I do believe that conditionality is actually a critical tool, and not to punish or to be right about it, but because the money is otherwise wasted.
Yeah. Ifueko.
For me, I'll say dig deeper. Do more research before proposing solutions or making statements, because I find that sometimes there's a lot of buzzword and it cuts across. So for example, sorry, I'm just using the example you use. We may find that the Civil Service Academy worked in a country, but that it worked in a country doesn't mean on its merit the Civil Service Academy will not work. But why is it not working in Nigeria? So why is there corruption with such impunity, as opposed to let's eradicate corruption? Why? Why aren't there social problems? Why are the monies that are being given not being done? So more of digging deeper, so we really, really understand what's going on, and then provide policies to support that.
Sanjeev.
First of all, I think the point that Alex made about number of donors, I think there has to be a lot more coordination across donors, and that coordination should be around a grand plan for the country, not that each donor is having his own program of implementation. I think that's the first thing we should talk about. The other thing is, from our perspective, it's good to have budget support, the question that you posed. And on conditionality, we write a little bit in this report that we submitted to you. The work that we have done shows that on the revenue side, conditionality works in other countries, but not in fragile states. It doesn't work because you need more time to implement the conditionality, not during the program period. I'm looking at 3-year program period that is typical for the fund. So that's on the revenue side. On the expenditure side, over time, the conditionality has been reduced when you start counting and looking at numbers. So, but the donors also have a problem. They have to report to the parliaments that the money is being used. So we have to find a way in which we can answer that question as well for the donors. Otherwise, the support will not be forthcoming.
Okay, Michael.
I'll have to leave at 20:15. So
yes, so please far away and then
I think it's a great question, and I was hoping that this commission might come up with redrawing the rules.
The reason I'm asking the question is we want to get people's feeling about this.
I think it's a great opportunity for you to sort of think afresh on this. So I really hope that. In terms of the specific question, the frustrations I have that I've seen on the ground in Pakistan and elsewhere with aid agencies are they don't get behind the government strategy. They're all sort of, it's like the helping hand striking again and again and again from different angles, which is a problem. The second thing is too often the donors themselves lack ambition. So they look at the state of the country and then they put a lot of money in for a very, very poor, low level of ambition. In fact, one big aid package that came to Pakistan while I was there set a goal for enrolment in Punjab that we had already achieved for the next 3 years. It wasn't British aid, I hasten to add.
Relief.
But because they just didn't accept our data and they set a goal, and when we challenged them, they said, well, our masters will much prefer us to set a low goal and achieve it. So I thought that was poor. Tackling the real problems, like there's a lot of dancing around corruption and some of the other difficult challenges that people just don't raise. It's got to find a language of raising those things. And then getting behind the kind of political leaders that I've been fortunate to work with, where you can find them. The second big thing I would say is that if you go back to the beginning of aid, say in 1950, or whenever you want to date it, if you had said to the people who started aid then, we'll still be doing aid in 2040, I'm sure they would have said, no, it'll have worked by then. And so at some point we need to set an end to aid, not for catastrophes and things like that, but you should imagine an end to aid as we've known it over the last 80 years, not because it's failed, but because it's succeeded. And I think so there almost needs to be a transition to a different way of thinking about aid, where obviously you support, in the case of catastrophes, obviously you support fragile states where states collapse, because that's a security threat to all of us. And as we see, most of the poverty problems are now in fragile states. So I think it needs reimagining. I did actually, while you were Prime Minister, send one of your advisors on aid a kind of 5-bullet point rethink of this, which I will send you again, and you can see if you like it or not. And the other thing is, I think there are basically 3 problems that you need to answer, all of which you could put aid behind, but it needs to be seen as a continuum, not separate things. One is conflict resolution, which the world does some of, but then the second is state building, which the world does some of, and the third is helping governments of states deliver.
Yeah, so our 5, if I can remember them all, is conflict, state legitimacy, state effectiveness, the role of the private sector, and the 5th, resilience.
And
I think we are covering all those areas.
But the world community, I mean, Paul is much more expert on this than me, but sees those as different activities. So there isn't a...
No, the aim is to bring them all together.
So to tell a story and to spend aid where we need it, to bring the countries through that continuum, I think would be... You do it in a very different way from the way we do it now.
Just on aid, there is worth... I was at the Bodleian the other day, And if they're chronicling all Oxfam's papers. And you go back to Oxfam in the 1950s, and of course it was sending aid to Germany.
Germany, yeah.
And you can argue that that was effective, or anyway, they certainly no longer need it. Right, we've got one question here and one up there. Yes, please, John, Tim. Yes, go on.
Is the right strategy the way to think about it? You have to operate under the political radar, because the way I'm thinking is, well, you work with a political leader who happens to have landed in a position and you can work with it. Is it completely wrong-headed to think that part of external intervention is also about changing the political system? I don't mean overtly, but I mean training
yes.
An area that one could think of some kinds of civil society interventions which are aimed at.
Yeah.
I mean, is that a no-go area?
No, not at all. On the contrary, and if you went from conflict resolution to state building, that is one of the things you would do. And in fact, Donald Karuki, your vice chair, and I teach on a course at Harvard that does that for health ministers, education ministers, finance ministers. That is exactly what we do.
But Michael is also saying, I think, that if your entire effort was to set up the education NGO in the Punjab and try and deliver schooling totally separate from the government, you'd actually be making the problem worse, because you'd end up with an illegitimate, unaccountable, undelivering state that wasn't doing the... So that's... But I... We're there. Right, sir.
Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much.
So a lot of the advice that you've kind of been giving today has been kind of about identifying agents of change and people who can bring about reform and improve state capacity. But I think it's worth remembering how fragile states got to the situation that they were actually in. It's not a case that, they're kind of over for someone who just knew what they were doing, they could do it. There are deep-rooted kind of patronage networks, rent-seeking behaviours from which a huge number of people are doing really, frankly, very well from the fragility. And we're trying to go in and change things and actually cause a lot of people to lose a lot of the kind of rents that they are kind of gaining. That's not to say we shouldn't do it. So my question is, how do we identify the people who might be able to act as agents of change in such a corrupt and kind of hierarchical system, and how do we give them the space to actually go and change something that doesn't kind of then end up, because we often see this happening, that they do some good work, but it's all fruitless because they suddenly get moved on because they've upset the wrong chief, and it's all back to square one. So how
why don't you try this one? And then we'll go to the back of the room, and then I think last couple of questions, and we're probably done.
So I think two quick thoughts. I think a lot of what we've talked about here is also about the fact that the governments aren't monoliths, no matter where you are. And so what you do have to find is where within that there is space for good people to perform. And it can often be in the same government where you will have a very challenging time. The Ministry of Mines, something that Paul has written a lot about, natural resource development. I mean, try working with the Ministry of Mines in a fragile environment. It is tough going because there is big money, low accountability, but maybe the places where you can find ability to change, whether it's rural development or Ministry of Health, and then that has a knock-on effect, because what starts to happen, as somebody said earlier, is that you then start to have mechanisms of accountability that kick into place, and people see, actually, you can get things done, and power accrues to those who can get things done. I mean, it's pretty amazing, even in a place like Afghanistan, other places where you start to have ministries and ministers and places that perform. They start to get attention, and then they attract resources from the donor community, and they get mentioned in speeches and invited to conferences. And so there is a weight within the system that we all work in that does reward progress and that can build on that. And so I think that that's one of the critical things, but you have to have this, just in response to your question as well, I think that we have to be focused on mechanisms of accountability at the local level. What is it that actually works for accountability? So the idea of training people, if you're trying to change the political system, I think one thing that we've learned from things like support to political parties and elections and all of that kind of political institution building work is that you have to be focused on local mechanisms that actually drive accountability, because those are ultimately the only things that will constrain people's behavior. And the international community doesn't really have the ability to impose that.
Hi.
Good afternoon. I think there's sort of two things I would like to talk about. The first, I think, is building capacity, and the second, I think, is actually about supporting what works. So in many of these sort of states we call fragile states, they're just big monolithic structures where you actually have regions or pockets where actually things work. Look at Nigeria. There are some states where actually the civil service has continued to work at the state level. But go to the federal level, which I think is just a very complex place to try to start to work. I think, so what I'm trying to say, I think, is that trying to work to find what works, be it at the local community level, the state level, the regional level, and supporting that rather than trying to cure all and work at the federal level to deal with all matter, I think is probably a more effective way to work. The other point I think is an observation. I'll talk about Nigeria mostly because I know a lot about Nigeria more than other countries. So when we actually got independence, we had an amazing civil service. It worked amazingly well. You had people, super PAMSECs, they all had Oxford PPEs and went to great schools, and they're brilliant guys. I just spent quite a bit of time with them recently, and they also the same that actually that to make these countries work, the civil service has got to work. And they describe the civil service actually like a CEO of a company. So you got a company, you can have a great strategy, great chairman, but unless you have the guys doing the work and driving the steering wheels, nothing is going to work. And then sort of go through, you go to places like the Middle Eastern countries where they've actually gone out and hired non-indigens to actually help build a strong civil service, instead of trying to do it all by themselves. So I think that's sort of opened our minds to not just saying it all has to be done from within, looking outside to build capacity and hiring the brightest and the best. Like if I run a company, you go and hire the brightest and the best to help you fix an issue. It doesn't have to be the Central Bank of the UK is run by a Canadian. They didn't say it had to be a Brit around the business.
Yeah. I don't know whether you want to come back on any of that, but it's good sense. And then we're going to go to the back. I think someone had a question at the back. Yes, lady at the back.
When the lady talked about what should NGOs do differently, and I said dig deeper, is because I think a lot of us, including myself, have formed our own thoughts and assumptions on what the realities are. The gentleman has just said at independence, Nigeria had an amazing civil service. But within 3-5 years, we had a coup. Why? On the face of it, I agree with it completely, that we need a civil service. But behind the scene, I'm saying to myself, were the seeds of distrust already set in at that time? What caused it? Was it because some people went to Oxford and a vast majority of people didn't? Did that cause a lot of resentment? Have we really thought through how to ensure that up to a particular level, everyone has a chance? Have we really done that? And so just looking at it purely from a civil service point of view, without looking at the people who are driving the civil service, their mindsets, the resentment that may have been caused out of no fault of theirs, but just because of the way the system is. I'm also a beneficiary, for example, of the Unity School system, which was designed in the 60s to be the best schools in the country. But over time, I've realized that just by talking and listening to the person that's giving me feedback, there's a lot of bitterness and resentment because of what I went through no fault of mine. And just because my parents wanted the best, I got scholarships. Some people don't even believe that there were scholarships because the system has not been fair to them. And this goes even before independence, post-independence, and we have ignored these issues. And so you ask yourself, in this book that I just read, somebody said that the day an army officer shot another army officer, he knew that was the end of the army, and he could almost predict that things will happen. The question I even ask is, but what did we do about it? Did we find out why? Now, that's what I mean by digging deeper, to go to the research to really understand what has created what we see today. Because the same Nigerians who we believe we can have from the outside, But the same night, just go outside, and they're doing very well. Why? They come back, they're frustrated. It takes a few. And I believe, like the gentleman, who've come back to try and succeed, but there are not many of them. Why? What is it that they have that the others do not have? And let's begin to build models that are customized to our own situation, and then work further to now develop policies along those lines.
Fair point. Lady at the back, and then gentleman, and then I think if that might be all we have time for, unless anyone's got a burning question. So, lady.
Thank you very much. I'm Catherine Beyer. I'm a colleague of Sanjeev's in the IMF, and so I would like to posit one proposal to your question, which is what can we do, maybe not radically differently, but better in the fragile states. And I do think that donor coordination is something we can do better. Many countries have donor coordination groups for the public financial management side, but not for the revenue side. This is something sort of relatively new in many countries. So coordinating ourselves better and having official, formal donor coordination groups to agree on revenue strategies and who does what, I think could give us a good bang for our buck and help and include the authorities as active participants in those groups. Just to address on how the IMF works in the fragile states, also I think it complementing what Sanjeev had said, we're very proud about the fact that we have a lot more tax and customs administrators. It's my division from the low-income developing countries on our teams today than we did some years ago. And so both at IMF headquarters and in our regional technical assistance centers, of which there are now 10 around the world, I look for sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and a lot of our long-term advisors are from the region. And a lot of our experts that we take with us on missions and for advisory purposes are from, if not from the countries, then from neighboring countries. So I think we have a way of weaving in local perspective much more effectively today than we did some time ago, and I think the countries appreciate that.
Am I right in saying also the IMF does more now to report on corruption in different countries where it has a program? Is that right?
I can answer that.
Yeah, please.
We did this paper for you when you had the summit last May.
Yeah.
Some of the programs were not taken to the board, Ukraine, Malawi, and Kenya. The management has taken the view that in countries where corruption is extreme, we should not be taking the programs to the board and giving them the money, because money is, after all, fungible. So there is that view which is now pervasive. And there is some conditionality which is coming in from that angle as well.
Thank you. Final question. Last two, sir, and then Rafat.
Thank you. Nemat Bijan, research fellow at Blavatnik School of Government. In terms of the capacity we discussed today, one issue is that we consider capacity as a one whole. So it seems to be fragmented, at least based on my experience, and at the three levels we have it at the apex of the state, policymakers, and then we have mid-managers, and then implementers. Often what we have is like a disconnect between policymakers, mid-managers who translate policies into more like implementable programs or projects, and implementers. That's one issue. In terms of like Punjab, Michael gave a very good example that it worked very well. But one question raises that whether direct access to power was a factor or not, because of the relationship of the leadership in Punjab province and in Islamabad. And also coming to another factor, very important, especially what Alex discussed and gave examples of pragmatism and also ownership in the case of health sector in Afghanistan. I wonder another factor that might have played a critical role, the education system, especially in the case of a health sector in Afghanistan. Most of medical doctors are working in that ministry. And medical faculties are one of the academic institutions that have maintained a certain level of standards or meet the international standards. I remember once someone coming asking another colleague that I hear that Afghanistan has good medical doctors. We can meet them, and the answer was go to the Ministry of Finance. That was a joke because they were like helping at the beginning of like in post transition. So just the issue was in terms of how can we deal with the issue of fragmentation at 3 different levels when it comes to state capacity.
Okay, I'm going to take Rafat's question and then we'll take those two together. And I think this will probably be for Alex mostly. Rafat.
So very quickly, maybe reflect on something that might shed some light on what was happening in Yemen with the IMF and the reforms in that very critical time of post-conflict and as things were being built. And basically, the major issue was fuel subsidy reforms. And what we saw like there was, for example, I think this is maybe will shed good light on what the issue is, because it's not only technical, as you said, it's technical and political, but the way the system is set up is mostly geared towards the technical. So the IMF people, for example, would meet a lot with the technical people, of course, but the resident representative wasn't really resident because the situation is post-conflict, not that stable, so it's fly in and fly out, fly some people out, mostly from the Ministry of Finance and others. But the key thing was, for the political process, we had the UN special envoy, and he was there, and he was leading the political process from the international community, working directly with the political leaders on every single step of the work. On the government side, on the fiscal capacity, on the services, on the economy, everything was collapsing and falling apart during the transition period, because all the focus was on the political process, and nobody was focusing on that. But countries never have a special envoy who could work with the leadership on all the critical issues of the economy. And we're saying now one of the major things that we focus on is the economy and services and building fiscal capacity. But where is that support at the senior level? It's not there. And so we're relying on the technical things and technical people when it really needs to be at a much higher level.
Interesting point. Retrain Stefan de Mistura as an international economist. And Alex, do you want to come back on? I think those are really both points for you more than anyone, I think.
Yeah, so I think 2 things. One, on this issue of coordination, I think that Rafat's comment also, I think that a challenge for you guys, I have spent a lot of my career in and out of think tanks. I have read as many lessons learned reports as you'd ever care to look at. Every single one of them has improved donor coordination in the top 5.
Yeah.
And it's there because it's true. But it's also there always because it's hard. I'm sure you would understand best of all how challenging it is for countries, particularly in high-profile environments, to subsume their will and capacity and influence into a collective. So, but it is a challenge to be wrestled with, because I do think it undermines us. And in fact, when you look at other areas of collective action, whether it's a NATO or a global fund, where is that thing in this sector? In fact, this is probably one of the most atomized of all of the major aid sectors that are out there. And so thinking about how you can not only think about the problem of coordination and just complain about it like everyone else does with good cause, but actually to think specifically in this sector, in the set of problems that you're trying to solve, what are some of the things that could reasonably be done? The reason that budget support is often interesting to people is that it is a collective mechanism. There are some good trust funds that have, I think, from the World Bank and others that have had some success in kind of coordinating policy, coordinating resource flows. But I do think that this is something that would be really worth the Commission's time. And there could be some interesting big ideas out there, at least experimental for particular places, if not globally. The second thing that I would say is, one of the things that we've heard over and over again that I think is really important is that in all of these environments, don't assume that there aren't people who can't do. And some of the criticisms that we were talking about here at lunch about the problems of training and the over-reliance on training, it's not the case that when you come into fragile states that there aren't a lot of people who can do, who can succeed. The problem is it's more of a systems problem than it is about the individuals. That's not to say that people's capacity doesn't need to be brought up to speed in certain areas. But what all of this needs is to be deeply rooted into systems thinking, which also gets to Namat's question about the multiple levels here. Because the reality is that, as Michael was talking about sort of this chain, right? If you want to get from the Prime Minister to the person who is closest on the ground to delivering services, there actually has to be a continuum there that somebody has thought through the reasons why there are disconnects. I will just close with saying that I was in Uganda recently, and we're working on a big fiscal decentralization project and helping the Ugandan government to figure out not only how to flow the resources, but to get more local control over those resources. And I took a bunch of Ministry of Finance officials out with me to not a super remote province. We got there in an hour-and-a-half drive. And none of them had ever been there before. Yeah. None of them had ever been to a clinic before. And, you know, they've got written up on the walls of the clinic, here's the budget for the clinic, here's how many people they serve, and they were shocked. They were shocked because the budget was so small and the problems so large, but also because they hadn't actually been physically to that. And so thinking constantly about that continuum and how to embed people successfully within a system, and not just focusing on, well, we need to bring certain individuals up to speed.
Thank you. Look, thank you very much. Thank you very much, our witnesses, and to Michael as well. It's been a really good session, actually, and I think thanks to our academics this morning, I think we've had a very clear set of messages about what works, what doesn't, and hopefully that will help us with our deliberations and producing our reports. So thank you very much indeed, and thanks for the wider questions.
Thank you.
Good. Meeting
Thank
closed.
you.